Hello and welcome to Super Awesome Runner. My name is Sam, the host of the show on the Super Awesome Mix Podcast Network. You can find more of the show's content at Super Awesome Runner on Instagram and on Threads. Been having a lot of fun on Threads. I am nearing 200 followers, which is great. Actually, nearing 150, but 150 is not that far away from 200. And it's been really, really fun to connect with runners there and the fitness community in general and just jump into some random conversations. It's been good. So if you're not already in the Threads, you know, bandwagon of runners, I highly recommend joining and just basically losing a lot of time to it, which is a funny thing to suggest the week after I talked about not scrolling so much. But I do find Threads to be a little bit more communicative and two-way compared to other social media content where it's generally just a one-way thing. So there is that. But one thing that does come up, and the reason I'm talking about Threads at all here, this comes up often, is this concept of gatekeeping. So if you are not familiar with gatekeeping, that's wonderful because that means you haven't experienced it in your life. And so I am jealous, but it is essentially the act of somebody literally, tending a gate and deciding who gets in and who doesn't. It could be someone deciding that you aren't hardcore enough of a runner, for example, and because you run slowly, or because you take walking breaks, or because you don't race, you only run, or because you don't wear the right watch or the right gear, et cetera, et cetera. What ends up happening with gatekeeping is that basically some group or some individual or some group of individuals decides that in order to be, you know, part of their self-defined group, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And if you don't do these things, you're not part of the group, and therefore you should not be able to identify as part of that group. And they will literally gatekeep. They will, tear you down in comments, or maybe this is happening in real life. Like maybe there's a running group you want to join and they don't want you as part of it because you wear the wrong shoes according to them, or you don't drink the right, mixture of electrolytes and eat the right bars and et cetera, right? Like people get really creative in how they want to keep you from joining their group. I bring this up because I am a big believer in obviously not doing this. I think gatekeeping is really toxic behavior, and I wanted to talk about why does it happen, because I'm always really fascinated by sociology and psychology, and why do we do the things that we do as a group of individuals? Because obviously, you can dive into someone's brain, but then things change whenever we are part of a group or identify as part of a group. And they can change for the better or they can change for the worse. In this case, gatekeeping, I think, is unfortunately changing for the worse. I say this all the time in the show, but we have a lot of evolutionary coding in us as human beings. Like we live in a very modern, fast-paced and fast evolving world, but for 10,000 plus years our world looked very different. The scale of technological advancement was a snail's pace. Like if you were to graph it, it would be a very, very, very slight slope up, and then all of a sudden in like the 18th century, 19th century, and certainly in the 20th and 21st century, it's like just a sharp turn up. With the discovery of like mathematics and calculus and physics, and then computers and the internet and so on, and smartphones. But for the bulk of our time on this planet, it was pretty much tribal, and you had villages and communities that you were a part of, and your survival very much depended on your ability to be a part of a group. There's a couple of things at play, but I think one element of it is this deep biological need to feel that you are part of a group because you will feel protected. Identity is a form of that. So for runners specifically who gatekeep, they probably believe that by setting up these false walls to keep others out, they are effectively keeping themselves in the group that they have defined the way that they've defined. And again, tribally, like that makes total sense. And you might think that you're not guilty of this. You might, maybe you're not, and that would be amazing. But I think we all are guilty of some form of tribal thinking. If you are a sports fan, that's a form of tribal thinking. You've got a team that you are devoted to and you cheer them on. And, there are other teams that you view as adversaries and you don't want them to win. You want them to lose in these games because you're cheering on for your team. It's a very like benign example of tribal thinking. There are other interesting versions of this. Researchers have found that it can be incredibly arbitrary. So it's one thing for you to be proud of like your city that you're from, your hometown, the team that you root for, the school that you went to college for. All of that, like I think, make a lot of intuitive sense to us that we kind of gatekeep and identify and say, well, I was part of that crowd, and therefore I'm a little bit better, I'm a little bit smarter, I'm a little bit stronger, I'm a little bit X, like some factor that you have because you went to the school or you lived in the city or you worked at a job. So researchers wanted to know how far could they take this tribal attitude. And I loved learning this in my sociology class, one of them in college. They took like a standard college classroom. Researchers would go in there at the start of the class, announce that they're doing a quick little study, and they would go up to a chalkboard and dot the chalkboard randomly, just truly just kind of pepper it with small little dots all over, and then ask everyone in the room to just take a guess on how many dots are on the chalkboard. Very large chalkboard, a lot of dots, again, just randomly spread across. There wasn't really a fast way to kind of calculate it. And so people then would write down on a card how many dots they expected there to be on the board. Researchers collected the cards, and then, they basically split the group up because I think the researchers knew how many dots they wanted to put on the board, but they're just, drawing them randomly. And they split the group up between people who overestimated and people who underestimated. You might be wondering what happens if someone literally guessed the number. To be honest, I don't know. That is a question that remains in my head for all these years. But let's imagine that basically everyone falls into one of these two groups. And I'm sure that if someone guessed the exact number, researchers probably by rule lump them into, let's say the over guessers. So the classroom is now split between two groups: people who, underreported the number of dots, people who overreported the number of dots. And then they had them take surveys, and the surveys ask questions about your group and then ask questions about the other group. So here were, a bunch of students all in the same classroom, all in the same school, same major, presumably because it's college and, you generally have like similar majors when you're in these classrooms. And they were taking these surveys of a split that had happened moments before, right? Like this wasn't some allegiance that they've had for years. Like they didn't grow up an underreporter of dots on a chalkboard and they were always going to be that way. No, right? This happened in the classroom in the context of like 10, 15 minutes. And they took these surveys. And on here, they would ask questions about like the intelligence of your group versus the others. They would ask questions about the attractiveness of your group versus the others. And they would ask all these like interesting questions that you would imagine that, again, this is a group that formed moments ago, that there should be no difference in how they report their groups versus the others. But spoiler or shocker, if I'm willing to bet you figured out what happened, the groups significantly reported that their own pairing, right, like their own little tribe, was more attractive, more intelligent than the other group. And the other group, again, was less attractive, less intelligent, and less all these other factors. We were, so I find that to be fascinating. That tells me a lot about human behavior, that we find a group, we feel comfort in this group and safety in this group, so much so that we identify as being part of the elite group, and every other group outside of us who had even the slightest, different understanding of a situation, we immediately view as inferior to us. That tells me so much about human behavior, and I imagine that you could see that very prevalent in our politics and, again, our sports allegiances, and our city allegiances, our country allegiances, even just our own families, the schools we went to, the jobs that we hold. The list goes on and on. We tend to find a group that we identify with and rank our group as the group that is better, smarter, faster, more attractive, so on. Everyone else is somehow less than. That's a very natural thing that we do because, from an evolutionary point of view, that was beneficial to us for those tens of thousands of years, because we did need the protection of our peers and our mates and our family members and friends in order to survive. And I imagine that the groups that stuck together very strongly and had a bond, whatever that bond was, probably did, fare better in the harsh realities of human life for those first thousands of years, versus the groups that didn't really see the point. Like the lone wolves basically kind of died off over time, and we were a little bit more of like pack animals. So that's the backdrop behind what I think is an enormous driver of gatekeeping. You work your way into being a runner, you hit a fast pace, you're running like 5-minute miles, like you are elite status runner. And as a result, you kind of like do a self scan and maybe even scan the people around you. And you're like, cool, well, I wear these, super expensive racing shoes and I eat these super expensive gels and I'm on a very strict diet and I have a nutritionist and I have a coach and I've got this and I've got that. And all of this starts to become kind of an identity that you feel you've worked very hard for and you've earned. And you see other people that have very similar kind of, a very similar identity construct. And you suddenly feel like I've arrived and this is my tribe. And unless you do all of these things, like you can never call yourself a runner the same way that I call myself a runner. They are threatened by the existence of a runner that runs in their like tennis shoes and like an old shirt, from from like 10 years ago that they got at a concert for free and that like fuels eating either nothing or like whatever's just free there on race day, et cetera, et cetera. Like those two things in their head are so different. The elite runner who eats Martine gels versus the average day runner who wears regular shoes and runs like a mile or two every so often. That breaks kind of that mold in their head that they've set aside of saying, nope, a runner is X, Y, and Z and only X, Y, and Z, and anything else is a threat to my identity and their, my tribe and that deep rooted evolutionary part of our brain that says, therefore, they are a threat to my existence. What do we do about that? I think we need to be patient with these people. And whenever someone tries to gatekeep you and tell you that you are too slow to be a runner or too blank to be a runner, or tries to keep you from being a better runner when you ask questions, you just need to, I always imagine giving a hug to someone who's like that because I think they kind of need like a hug. I think they might just not be aware of what they're doing and they probably don't have negative intentions. They might in some cases, but they're kind of doing what they're coded to do. And I think if you can ignore them, that's what you need to do is ignore them. And you should try to find people like myself who believe that gatekeeping is a toxic behavior and who want to grow the sport of running. I actually think one of the most unique parts about running is the fact that you can have super elites next to people who run once a week every so often. And race day is a magical culmination of that. Like you're standing in the corral shoulder to shoulder with hundreds and thousands of people, and they all are about to run a race. They are all runners, and they are all incredibly different from one another. I think like what other sport has that kind of like dynamism in the type of athletes that show up? It's incredible. Every single gender, weight, ethnicity, background, training program, foods you eat, foods you don't eat, shoes, gear, etc. And they're all standing next to each other and they're all about to run the 10K or the marathon or half or whatever the distance is. That's super cool. And I think by growing it, we increase the diversity of running. We learn from one another and we have just a better sport in general and the resources increase for all of us and we lift each other up. That's my view of, it's like the opposite of gatekeeping. I actually think like more people in is going to be more fun and helpful. But again, I think the people who do gatekeep are coming from this like biological background and this fear of loss of control and fear of extinction, basically, to take it to an extreme. And the best thing to do, I think, is just ignore them. Maybe try to redirect their behavior and ask them, and maybe gently call it out and say, "Hey, I think you might be gatekeeping. Is there a way that you can you know, can we talk about this in a more open way? Or how did you get to where you wanted to be? Because I am interested in learning from you and trying to redirect the conversation around like putting them maybe in more of a mentoring and nurturing position rather than a lording over position of saying like I'm better than you and I will always be better than you and I'm never going to tell you my secrets. If all else fails, block them and move on with your life and find someone better. That's my opinion, at least. Um, because there are thankfully a lot of people like me, and I've been connecting with them on threads, like I said, and it's been a lot of fun. But yes, I hope that is helpful context for the next time you see someone gatekeeping on running, or frankly anything, right? I think fans of movies also tend to gatekeep, and TV shows. People who pour over every inch and line of like canon of Star Wars versus the people who watch it every so often or have maybe liked, the prequels and you think that the prequels were terrible and you could never be a real Star Wars fan if you like them, et cetera, right? Like let them kind of be them and maybe maybe point it out because some people might not know that they're doing it and they might actually want to change that behavior. So we can hope for the best, right? We've all been guilty of it, and I think hopefully we can all learn from it and try to stop gatekeeping and instead invite people and be more inclusive. With that, I'm going to leave you to this week. I hope there's no gatekeepers in your life. I hope, if you find yourself doing it, you can kind of catch yourself in the act. I'm guilty of it myself. I'm not some saint. Like I always say, like I'm not good at this either, but I do try to be much more aware of it and change my behavior to be a little bit more welcoming and inclusive. So we can always get a little bit better. That's the context of this entire podcast, frankly. I hope you have an amazing week ahead, and I will see you next Tuesday.